Let me pray, and then we'll jump right in. Father God, we thank you for your presence with us. We thank you for your love and your grace. And I pray that as we talk about something that's hard to talk about and probably a little uncomfortable to talk about, Holy Spirit, that you will be the one who's guiding us through our discussion tonight, that you'll lead us into all wisdom, that you'll help us to find community and encouragement for one another as we seek to do something which is really difficult, which is to engage with our kids on things that are hard to talk about. We pray that you'll do it in Christ's name. Amen. So Mark mentioned that a little while back I got to go to the beach for senior high camp and lead the boys and then the girls through separate breakout sessions. And one of the things that we talked about during that breakout session was the fact that your sexuality is a good thing. I said it's not going to be that kind of sex talk where the whole time is don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Let me come up with 43 more ways to tell you not to do it. Okay? We said that your sexuality is a good thing, and in fact, it's a God-given thing. But in the world that we live in, the world that we've always lived in, your sexuality is under attack. Now, I'm going to be going pretty fast through these, so if you need me to stop and let you catch up or repeat something, just raise your hand. This is real informal, so you can just kind of speak up when you need to. We are going to try to go quickly so that we'll have some time at the end for questions. So, if that's the case, and we're wanting to talk to our kids in a way about sex that's not shaming, that doesn't make it taboo, that doesn't make it something that must not be spoken of, tonight we're going to, in our preparation, talk about some things that are potentially uncomfortable to talk about. We are going to hear and use terms that might make some of us squirm, but we're going to do that not for sensationalism, not for shock value, but because really what's at stake is our kids' future. And if we don't talk to them in ways that are real and honest and open, then we're going to be some of the only voices in their lives that aren't. Because the world is speaking very clearly to our kids about this, but they're telling them lies. Okay? We need to be able to speak just as clearly and unashamed, but telling the truth. So, buckle up. There may be some words you don't usually hear said in church, but they're not dirty words. They're just calling it what it is. So, let's talk about what our kids are exposed to. By their 18th birthday, your kids have seen internet pornography in very, very large numbers. In fact, 93% of boys and 62% of girls have seen internet pornography by the time they're 18 years old. By the time they're 18, 83% of boys and 57% of girls have seen group sex represented unsimulated online. We're not talking about pictures, we're talking about real, graphic, hardcore porn. By their 18th birthday, the percentage who have seen same-sex intercourse is 69% of boys and 55% of girls. So some of the most extreme types of porn that we can imagine, not just dirty pictures, are things that a significant majority of our kids have seen. And that's not just the exposure, but one of the things that's happening in our culture along with the exposure is a change in perception. Let me show you this. Societal beliefs about porn's value or evil are really shifting. So this graph represents the percentage of people who believe that porn is bad for society. And blue represents always bad, green, sometimes it's bad. So teenagers, 43% combined, have a feeling that porn is or could be bad for society. Among young adults, which is 18 to 24, that's 31%. Among older millennials, 51%. Gen Xers, which is me, anybody who's in their mid-40s, probably a lot of us are kind of right around that place, some younger, some older, 44%. And among baby boomers, you might expect that this is the highest percentage at 59%. So does that surprise anybody that there's so few groups where there's a majority that thinks that it might be a negative thing? That in most all categories, 60% of these categories, more people think it's harmless than even think that it might be harmful. Why do you think that the boomers are the highest percentage that have a problem with pornography? They weren't exposed as much. Okay? Not that they weren't exposed at all, but not as much. Okay? Yeah, more time to experience and observe what happens with repeated exposure. Yeah. I agree. I think those are, yes. That's a fact. I mean, I'm not a boomer, but I know that my access was much more limited when I was a teenager. If you wanted to look at pornography, you had to go buy a magazine, or you had to summon up the courage to sneak into the back room of the video store that was behind that curtain, because there wasn't an internet when I was in high school. I mean, literally, the internet didn't exist yet. So yeah, access is another big part of it. Why do you think that older millennials, though, this is like people in their late 20s, early 30s, that's the biggest spike other than baby boomers of people who think that maybe it's bad? Any ideas about why that could be? Older millennial is going to be older 20s through about mid 30s. I think it's the same thing you said before.
Yeah, I just think that's the age of the show, television show Friends,
Mm-hmm.
and all the shows that were around that, where casual sex is very normal
Right.
part, and they've seen the negative effects of that in their own lives or their friends' lives.
Because the shows don't portray the after effects, but they're beginning to experience the after effects. So yeah, I think that we're onto something there. So now we've talked about what they're seeing. We've talked about how we feel about it as a society. What about what we call porn 2.0? Okay, this is where it stops becoming something that we observe and it begins to be something that we participate in. Look at this graph right here. This is teens and young adults, so this is like 13 through about 24, who have received nude images. We're talking about sexting here, okay? Either email attachments or much more likely something like Snapchat or a texted picture. 63% have received a naked picture of someone, okay? And most of them, it was from a boyfriend or girlfriend, but from 21%, it was just from friends. And then this is the breakdown between male and female, teenagers and young adults. What about teens and young adults who have sent a nude picture? It's 40%. 4 out of every 10, 2 out of every 5 young people have experienced taking a naked picture of themselves and sending it to somebody else. Now, the vast majority, of course, it's to a boyfriend or girlfriend, but that's perpetuating the unhealthy views of sexuality. It's making it something virtual. It's not something that we're waiting until the proper context. And then there's the breakdown. So, this is Martin Daubney. Martin Daubney is the former editor. He's a British publisher, a media guy, and he used to publish a magazine called Loaded. Loaded is kind of the British equivalent of some of the magazines like Details or kind of the men's magazines that kind of push the envelope, not necessarily what you would define as a pornographic magazine, but a magazine that did frequently feature kind of what they would call stylistic nudity. They would show bare breasts, but they wouldn't show sexual activity. And for a long time, he defended that, thinking it was harmless. Now, Martin is not, to my knowledge, a believer. But I want you to hear some of the comments, because he's done in his new career an awful lot of good research on the effects that pornography is having among the younger generation in Great Britain. Listen to what he said. I used to be skeptical that porn was as damaging a force as the headlines suggest. In the past, I'd even defended pornography in university debates, on TV, and on radio. I claimed it was our freedom of choice to watch it and said it could actually help to add to adult relationships. But what I saw during the making of documentary Porn on the Brain changed my opinion of pornography forever. I feel as if an entire generation's sexuality has been hijacked by grotesque online porn. This is one of the reasons why he says that. This is a picture that I did a Google search on for 14 and 15-year-olds. Okay, that was the image, one of the images that came up in Google. No, sorry, 13, 14-year-olds. So think about these kids. I want to read from an article that Martin wrote for The Star, which is a British newspaper. Some of this is going to be hard to hear. I just want to tell you, but it's important. This is what he said. The moment I knew internet pornography had cast its dark shadow over the lives of millions of ordinary British teenagers will live with me forever. I was sitting in the drama hall of a specialist college in the north of England, one with a fantastic reputation. Before me were a group of 20 boys and girls, aged 13 to 14, largely white, working-class children. They were well-turned out, polite, giggly, and shy. As the presenter of a Channel 4 documentary called Porn on the Brain, I'd been invited to sit in on a forward-thinking class led by sex education consultant Johnny Hunt, who is regularly asked into schools to discuss sex and relationships. To establish what these kids knew about sex, including pornography, he had asked the children to write an A to Z list of the sexual terms they knew. Need my reading glasses. No matter how extreme. Most of these children had just hit puberty, and some were clearly still children, wide-eyed, nervous, with high-pitched voices. Some of the girls were beginning their first forays into makeup. Several wore braces on their teeth. Everybody was smartly turned out in a school uniform, and the most anti-authority statement in the room was a tie worn deliberately short. A One Direction pencil case lay on a desk. These were clearly good children from good homes. So far, so very, very ordinary. But when Johnny penned their lists on the board, it turned out that the children's extensive knowledge of porn terms was not only startling, it superseded that of every adult in the room, including the sex ed consultant himself. Nugget? What's that? Asked Johnny. A nugget is a girl who has no arms or legs and has sex in a porno movie, chortled one young pimply boy, to an outburst of embarrassed laughter from some and outright revulsion from others. The adults in attendance were incredulous at the thought that not only did this kind of porn exist, but that a 14-year-old boy may have actually watched it. But the more mundane answers were just as shocking. For example, in their A to Z list, the first word every single boy and girl in the group put on their list was anal. When questioned, they had every child in a class of 20, seen sodomy acted out in porn videos. I was stunned they even knew about it. I certainly hadn't heard of it at that age, let alone watched it, and as a result, may have even wanted to try it. One 15-year-old girl said, boys expect porn sex in real life. And one boy, to the choruses of approval, spoke of his revulsion for pubic hair. When Johnny pointed out that pubic hair was normal in real life, the boys scoffed. But some of the girls were angry that the boys' template of what to expect from real girls had already been set by porn. By the end of the hour-long class, and 3 others that followed with other children, I was profoundly saddened by what I had witnessed. While teenage boys will always be fascinated by and curious about sex, what's now considered normal by under 18s is an entirely distorted view of intercourse and the way relationships should be conducted. Martin says, ultimately, the responsibility lies with us, the parents. The age of innocence is over. We need to get tech savvy, and as toe-curling as it seems, we are the first generation that will have to talk to our children about porn. We have to tell our kids that pornographic sex is fake and real sex is about love, not lust. By talking to them, they stand a chance. If we stick our head in the sand, we are fooling only ourselves. Again, words spoken from a man that, to my knowledge, is not even a believer, but is able to see the devastating impact that it has on society. So this might be some of the things that we're feeling right now, right? But we can't get so sidetracked by the emotions that it makes us feel that we lose out on the opportunity that we have. So the opportunity moving forward right now is to get some answers to the questions of how has it gotten so bad, what are some of the contributing factors, and what do we do about it? Well, first of all, one of the reasons why it's getting bad is because of early exposure. Okay, our kids on average are first being exposed to hardcore porn around the age of 10 years old. Okay, anybody remember what you were doing at 10? I was standing in line to see The Empire Strikes Back. And then for the second time and the third time and the fourth time. But I had no concept of pornography, but that's when most kids are seeing it for the first time. And the problem, among many other problems, is that they are not cognitively ready to handle what they're seeing. They're not ready physically, emotionally, psychologically to healthfully process sexual imagery because they're not supposed to see it. They're not supposed to experience it at that age. They're not even in puberty yet, but it's happening. So another thing that's happening in our society is people are waiting longer and longer before they get married. So the gap between exposure and marriage is longer in our culture than it's ever been. In 1960, the average marrying age in the United States was 22 for men and 20 for women. I was 21. Stacy was 20 when we got married. We got married in 1992. We kind of bucked the trend because in the 90s, it was more like 26 and 23. By 2013, it was 29 for men and 27 for women. So people are waiting longer and longer to get married, and there's a variety of reasons, not all of them having to do with sexual brokenness. Some of that has an influence on it, but people are staying in school longer, people are establishing more of their careers before they settle down. There's a number of reasons, but the fact remains, if you've got a middle schooler or a high schooler then they're saying, wait a second, how am I supposed to wait another 10 or 15 years before I can experience this thing? And especially when you factor in the fact that a lot of them have already seen it. A lot of them have already been exposed to it. Some of them have already participated in it. And now in our conversations, we're saying, no, God has a better way, and he wants you to wait. It's hard enough, isn't it, to wait for something you've never done? What about stepping back from something that you've experienced? It's even harder. And through pornography or masturbation or acting out sexually with other people, many, many, many more of our kids than ever before already have that exposure. Most of them before we've ever had a conversation with them about it. So, what's society telling them? And this is going to be really, really quick. I'm going to run through this. Society says you shouldn't have to wait. You don't have to wait. Waiting is stupid. Waiting is impossible. Okay? So there's very, very little affirmation in the world that bestows the virtues of abstinence. Most of the time, abstinence is either looked at neutrally or scoffed at. So they're getting a lot of input that says go for it. What about within the church? Well, we say don't do it, right? I grew up, and every time we talked about sex, the message was like, anybody ever seen that Bob Newhart Mad TV sketch? What's it called? Stop it. Right. I'm a psychologist. I give $5 advice. Tell me your problem. Okay, $5. Stop it! Well, that's typically the beginning, middle, and end of the conversation that people in our generation heard, isn't it? Growing up in conservative Christianity. Don't ask me why. Just do what I say and don't do it. We don't do it. We don't talk about it. Just end of discussion. And there's nothing like making that'll make somebody want something more than making it forbidden, right? I mean, I think Paul talks about that in Galatians. Is one of the purposes of the law was to show us that we can't keep the law. He gives us the law, and just before you can do this, we've broken it. And so if the extent of our conversation is don't do it, that's not good enough. But sometimes we unintentionally do even more harm than that. And we will, through the way that we shame people in the way we talk about sin, and I'm not just talking about our kids, but what they hear us saying about other people, you just need to try harder. You just need to pray more. You just need more accountability. You know, you're doing that so much, you're probably not really a Christian. And sometimes these are the messages that our children hear us saying, whether they're about them or about other people. And this is not the type of message that's going to set a table of safety for them to come to you with the things that they're struggling with, or to come to me with the things that they're struggling with. So what do we want to do instead? Well, first off, we got to realize this is an intense battle. This is a spiritual issue. Don't hear me saying that this is not a spiritual issue. But hear me clearly when I'm saying this is not just a spiritual issue. There are spiritual things at stake, but this is also a physical, a neurochemical issue. There is a battle going on in your heart and in your brain. And people who are addicted to pornography or sex, who are Christians, often beat themselves up, shame themselves because they're like, I don't want to do this. It's gotten to the point where I know it doesn't do anything for me anymore, but I can't seem to stop. Why can't I stop? What's wrong with me? I need to pray more. I need to try harder. I need more accountability. I'm probably not a Christian. It's not just the spiritual side of things that's going on. We don't ignore that, but we also take a view of the big picture, the bigger picture, that along with the spiritual struggle, this is a struggle that's going on in our brains. And this is something that I taught to some of y'all's children if they went to senior high camp. Remember these statistics? By their 18th birthday, they've seen this. Well, guess what? Their brain remembers that too. Because whenever we're exposed to sexual stimuli, stuff happens in our brains, right? And that's the way that God's designed them. See, God has designed their brain for a number of things, for learning and storing information, for making decisions, for logical reasoning. He's also designed their brains in part for sex. And the way I know that is by the amazing, creative, and beautiful way that he has designed certain chemicals to be released that do different things at different stages in healthy sexuality. So let's talk about that for a minute. It's going to feel like junior high health class, so just forgive me. I don't mean to be talking down or over or making anybody uncomfortable. But let's talk about what happens in our brain between a husband and a wife. When husbands and wives pursue each other sexually and arousal begins, the brain releases dopamine. We've all heard of dopamine, right? Okay, dopamine, it creates a state of tension and focus. It helps us to lock in. It creates that gotta have it feeling. It remembers pleasurable feelings and experiences, and it tries to repeat them. So dopamine doesn't just get released in sexual context. Dopamine gets released when I eat a piece of pizza, because I like pizza, and so my brain releases dopamine. It releases dopamine when I go for a run, because that feels good, and I like how my body feels when I go for a run. So there's a lot of different situations in which the brain releases dopamine, but sexual activity is one of them. It's a pleasurable experience, it feels good, and the brain likes it and wants to do it over and over again. Okay? Well, at the same time that dopamine is being released, so is norepinephrine. Norepinephrine increases arousal, it makes us more alert, and it burns the experience more deeply into our minds. So now we've got dopamine and norepinephrine, and those things are firing, which if you're Solomon in Song of Solomon and you read some of the things that he's saying when he's describing his pursuit of his beloved, Solomon be having some dopamine and norepinephrine flowing. Okay? That's going on. He's turned on, and that's the way God created it. Because we're supposed to pursue one another sexually when we're married. Well, what about at the moment of climax sexually? Well, then the brain releases oxytocin. Oxytocin releases at the moment of orgasm, and it creates a bond to the person with whom you're having sex. Creates a bond. Anybody remember anything about Scripture talking about sex creating a bond? When it cautions us against having sex with prostitutes and having sex outside of marriage, do you not know that he who has sex with a prostitute becomes one with her, right? That's the bond that God is describing on a spiritual level, but it also is happening on a neurochemical level. The oxytocin is creating a bond that draws you close and intimately into relationship with the person you're having that experience with. At the same time, vasopressin is released. Along with oxytocin, it's also a bonding chemical, and it leads to something called partner preference, which strongly associates you with the person that you're with. And this has been proven in human experiments, in animal kingdom experience, that when we're sexual, then it creates a preference to the person that we're with. Okay? So this is beautiful. And then after the climax, the brain releases serotonin. And that creates feelings of calmness, satisfaction, a sense of well-being. There's the buildup, there's the intensity of the bond, and then there's the relaxation. And think about that, y'all. In the context of a marriage relationship between a man and a woman, that is beautiful, right? I mean, that's an amazing design. We probably couldn't have come up with anything close to that. But God loves us, and he wants us to experience pleasure in the right way. And so he's created our bodies and our brains to work alongside of his plan and his structure for sexuality in order to make it amazing and pleasurable for us. So, what's the problem? Well, looking at porn triggers nearly identical neurotransmitters and hormones as having sex. The effect is very, very different. What do I mean by that? Well, looking at porn releases those chemicals at unnaturally high levels over an unnaturally long period of time. So think about it. When we have sex with our spouse, it doesn't last 5 hours, right? But a porn binge does. So when we're approaching our spouse, the dopamine is firing, the norepinephrine is firing. We engage in our sexual behavior. The oxytocin and the vasopressin, they fire, and then the serotonin. And however long it takes, it's not hours and hours and hours and hours, and then it's over and the cycle begins again. And then later on, however many hours or days later, we come together again. Well, in porn, you've got somebody who's at a computer with their pants around their ankles, looking at pornography for hours at a time, masturbating but keeping themselves from finishing long, because they've learned by now, maybe not knowing what's going on, but through experience, that when those chemicals get firing, the prefrontal cortex, which is our rational decision-making part of our brain, goes to sleep, and the instinct takes over. But then, as soon as we're finished, it wakes back up, and that's the, what did you do? The sense of guilt, and the sense of, oh my gosh, I did it again. And so there's a desire to extend that because we know how it's going to be. Anybody who's addicted to pornography knows how it's going to be eventually, and they want to delay it while bonding with no one. And that's really a critical element to consider. We are firing off oxytocin and vasopressin, and we are by ourselves. So what are we bonding with? We're bonding with a screen. We're bonding with a phone. We're bonding with an experience that is solitary. That's not the design. That messes us up. Eventually, what happens over repeated exposures, the brain becomes super sensitized to pornography. The pleasure threshold rises. With that threshold, that means it takes more porn and more graphic types of porn just to get aroused. So it doesn't end up where it starts. Where it starts, it seems harmless. Hey, this is something everybody does. Hey, no big deal. It's not hurt. It's a victimless crime. But before too long, with the repeated exposure, people who look at pornography begin to realize that what did it for me before isn't doing it for me now. I got to look at more. I got to look at it for longer. I've got to look at types of porn that didn't used to turn me on and kind of scares me that it does now, because it is an escalating process. Because of extended porn use, many men are delaying marriage or avoiding it altogether. They're choosing pornography over a real relationship. That's one of the contributors to why people are getting married so late. But what about when they do? Now, I say young men. I don't want you to get the suggestion that only men are the ones who are looking at pornography and who are getting addicted to sex, because this is not a statistic that I have on the slides tonight, but the fact of the matter is, there was a recent study that interviewed 31 to 49-year-old men and women, and then 16 to 30-year-old men and women, and asked them about, do you use porn at least once a month? Do you use porn more than twice a week? And in both of those groups, there was an increase in the younger group. The younger group of men who look at porn once a month was about 18% higher than the older men who look at porn once a month. Okay? The younger women, 18 to 30, who look at porn once a month, was 475% higher than 31 to 49-year-old women who look at porn once a month. That is because, in part, of technology that makes it easier to get sucked in. It's in part because of romance porn, 50 Shades, Magic Mike, pressure to do what the boy asks you to do, because if you don't, somebody else will. And then the statistics of people who look at it more than twice a week went up by about 66% among the men, and again, 420% for the women. So this is not just a man's issue, and it is an ever-growing problem for women as well, but numerically, there's still more men who are doing it than women. So there's a study that the University of Pennsylvania did on pornified young men. That's a term that's been coined, of men who've been so saturated by their porn use that it has had an effect on how they just function in normal life. Some of the behaviors of pornified men you see right there in your notes. There's more sex partners. They're actually less interested in having sex, because why bother? If you're pursuing somebody, there's a very pragmatic approach to it. They might say no. You might have to do stuff and take to dinner. I mean, let me just go home. That's easier. But when they do have sex, they try to get their partners to act out the scenes that they've seen in porn. They're desensitized to violence and degradation of women, because that's what they see over and over again in pornography. If they're married, they have more affairs. They more frequently hire prostitutes. In fact, the same Pennsylvania study said that 25% of 19 to 21-year-olds said that they've either already been to a prostitute or plan to in the near future. 25%, y'all. And these are people that are just a couple of years out of high school. Some of it is because we're so afraid to pursue relationship in which we're going to have to be authentic and honest and transparent and vulnerable. It's not worth the risk. So if we do want to be with a real person, we're just going to find one that we can pay for, who can't say no, who can't reject us. Because by this point, sex is not about relationship. It's about getting off. And that's the reality that our pornified young people are living in. Here's another one that you wouldn't necessarily think. The same Pennsylvania study studied men who have excessive pornography use and found that 58% of them experienced erectile dysfunction when they were with a real woman, but not when they used porn. That's not something that our 13 and 14-year-olds are thinking about when they're dabbling in porn. They're not thinking about the fact, this is great because if I keep doing this and when I get married, I'm not even going to be able to have sex without using porn. We don't think about the ramifications. But we, as parents, have to think about the ramifications because this is where it goes. It's like a cresting tidal wave. And all the years that they're young and they're being exposed to it, it's swelling and it's swelling, it's growing. And then when they get to the point where now they're entering adulthood, it comes crashing down on them in a wave of consequences. Okay, so everybody depressed, right? We all thoroughly depressed. We got to remember, though, it's not just about the neurochemistry. It's also about the heart. God designed their heart as well as their brain. And we do want to focus most of our attention on that. But before we get off the brain, I do want to say one thing that's very hopeful. There's a concept that neurologists talk about called neuroplasticity. Have any of y'all heard of neuroplasticity? In a nutshell, what does that mean? The brain is, it's plastic, right? Meaning it's moldable and changeable. When we look at sexual imagery, it forms a neural pathway. It's almost like carving a ditch. If we stop doing that, that ditch will fill in and new, healthier ones will be carved. So all is not lost, okay? All is not lost. We can turn away from this. We can come back from this. Your kids, no matter how deep their exposure, can come back from this. And one of the ways that they're going to do it is by having parents who are going to help them focus on what's going on in their hearts. So let's talk about that. God designed your heart for relationship, for intimacy, for real connection. We got to understand what the problem is. One of the problems, porn creates isolation. We were created for relationship and intimacy. And by the way, intimacy does not equal sex. We got to stop equating those terms. How many people have heard those radio commercials about this will help you increase intimacy? Really? Taking this pill will help me open up my heart and share all my hopes and dreams and fears with my wife? That's not what they're talking about. They're saying it's going to help your sex life because they equate the terms intimacy with sex. Saying intimacy equals sex is like saying worship equals music. Okay? What's happening there? We're taking a concept and by limiting it, defining it by one aspect, we're lowering the value of the concept and we're placing too high of an expectation on the aspect. So by saying intimacy equals sex, well, let's say worship and music, you go to church, hey, how was the worship today? Oh man, I knew almost all the songs. It was great, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's saying that there's nothing more to worship than the songs that we sing. And there's a lot more to worship than the song. It's an important part of it, but it's not all of it. Well, intimacy and sex, every time we hear the word intimate, we think sexual. That's cheapening intimacy, and it's blowing sex way out of proportion. Because guess what? You can have intimacy on varying degrees in varying appropriate ways with a lot of people in your life, men and women. You can have intimate relationships with people of your same gender. Jonathan and David had an intimate relationship that was not sexual, no matter how many people are trying to redefine it and say that it was. Because intimacy is where we open ourselves up, we allow ourselves to be fully known by another person, okay? That is a very important part of sex, isn't it? Because when we're with our husband or wife, that's a part of what's going to make that sexual part of our intimacy even more amazing because there's trust there, there's vulnerability there. But intimacy doesn't equal sex. Porn promises intimacy, but it creates isolation. And the problem here, sex addiction is an intimacy disorder, and intimacy disorders cannot be cured in isolation. By definition, you can't fix an intimacy disorder on your own. Pornography draws you into a deep hole of isolation and says you're going to find intimacy there. It's ludicrous, but we buy into it, sometimes very slowly and incrementally. See, intimacy requires relationship. It requires vulnerability and risk. It requires human connection, humility, and a dependence upon others. I'm going to leave this up there for a minute, so it's okay. But porn delivers loneliness, this myth of safety, anonymity, which anybody who has wondered why they're getting 400 emails a week in their inbox talking about erectile dysfunction and penis enlargement, it's connected to your porn use because the websites put identifying marks or cookies on your computer, and if you start seeing this in more frequency, there's probably somebody using your computer for not great reasons. So there's nothing that's truly anonymous. There's no connection. There's dominance rather than humility, especially in the way it portrays male-female relationships, and complete and utter disconnection. So it's promising one thing and it's delivering a completely different bag of goods. So how do we help our sons and daughters navigate through this? I think one of the things we have to realize is that this largely boils down to a single question. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying ultimately it boils down to a single question, and that is, do I trust God? It goes all the way back to the garden, doesn't it? When the serpent came to Eve and said, did God really say? And then he challenged what God had said, and he caused that seed of distrust to be formed. And that's when it all started to go to pot. And as Christ followers, a lot of times we would have to answer that question, no, I do not. As much as we want to, our actions show a lot of times we don't trust God. A lot of times we say, I'm going to step out in faith with my plan B in my back pocket, just in case God doesn't come through. So it's not just our kids. All of us struggle with really, truly trusting God. The way Francis Chan put it in Forgotten God, his book on the Holy Spirit, he said, I want to be so dependent upon God to show up in my life to where if he does not show up, if he does not come through, I am utterly screwed. That's the kind of dependence and trust that we want to have. And our kids are going to have trouble with that because when it comes to sex, you're telling me to wait how long? If I've seen it when I'm 10, and I'm not going to get married maybe till I'm 30, 20 years? Do I trust God? Do I trust God? If he says to wait, does he want what's best for me? Does he really love me? Does he know what I need? Is he able to give me what I need? Can he care for me better than I can care for myself? Can I survive without sex until marriage? Y'all, I don't want to get gross, and so I won't, but I will say that with what we do, I talk to a lot of men who have struggled with porn for a lot of their lives. And more frequently than you would think, men ask me about when they have been looking at porn every day, masturbating, if not daily, then 4 or 5 times a week, in addition to sex with their wives. Many men who are separated or who are single or who are abstaining now, they, as a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old, will come and they'll tell me about what they discovered when they woke up. And that's never happened to them before. They're like, is there something wrong with me? We got people in their 30s and 40s who have never experienced a wet dream because they've never given their body the opportunity. And this is one of the cool things, again, I don't want to be gross, but this is one of God's gifts of kindness to us because he's designed our bodies to where if we are not experiencing sex because we're not in the context where we can do it according to his standard, our body will take care of it. And it will provide a release without us having to be sexual in a way that's not wholesome and is not honoring to him. And most of our young men have never experienced it. I mean, think about that. That's really something. Do I trust God? So, what's our strategy, our tactic? What's our game plan? If we want to take this information and take it to our kids and provide an opportunity to really start a dialogue with them, what amazing tactic, okay? Let's go, Oliver. Got pen in hand, I'm ready. Lay it on me. You ready? Here it is. Talk to them. And that's pretty much it, y'all. Talk to them. You're like, well, you make that sound like it's easy. No. It's not easy, but it is simple. And there's a big difference between simple and easy. Simple means it's not complicated. Something uncomplicated can still be very, very difficult, right? Where do I even start? I mean, she's 16 and I've never once brought it up. You know, he's 15 and, you know, I feel like I'm going to say, hey, son, let's talk about sex. And he's going to say, sure, Dad, what do you want to know? You know, and well, how do I do it? Well, again, there's a difference between simple and easy, and we need to discover what that difference is. When I talk to the students at the beach, God started something in a lot of their hearts. there's a group of those boys who came to Wes and Mark and me and said, can we get together like before you make us do lights out? We want to talk about this. And in the conference room where we met, there was a group of them that stood in a circle and one at a time confessed their struggles with pornography to one another, just openly, and said, I need you guys to help me with this. I want this out of my life. We've heard talks like this forever, and it never changes. A week and a half later, I'm right back to it. I don't want it to be like that. These are words out of their mouths. Several of the boys rode back in the van that I was driving, and we were talking more about it. One of the young men said, I really want this to stick. I'm terrified to talk to my parents about it. And so I said, why are you scared to talk to them? He goes, well, I don't know what they'll say. I said, well, what might happen? He said, well, they might get mad. I said, okay, well, what happens if you tell them and they get mad? And he thought for a second. He said, well, I mean, I guess I can still feel good about the fact that I told them. I said, yeah. I said, do you think they'll get mad? He said, no. I said, what do you think they'll do? He says, well, I think they'll support me. I think they'll want to help. I said, but you don't know, right? He says, no, I don't know. I said, well, that's called intimate relationships. You don't get the closeness without the risk. And I hope that you'll take the risk, because I think you have a good idea of how they'll respond. I hope you'll take the risk. And he texted me the next morning. He said, I talked to my mom and dad about it last night, and they were awesome. They were really supportive. They want to help me in any way they can. Y'all, a lot of your kids are afraid to talk to you about sex and about what they've been exposed to. And even if it was somebody saying, hey, look at this, and that's how they saw it, they weren't looking for it. 70% of kids say that their first exposure to porn was involuntary. They didn't want it, they weren't looking for it, but somebody showed it to them and it did something to them, okay? But even if you're the kid, yours is the kid who saw it like this and didn't do anything wrong, they're still afraid to talk to you about it because they feel ashamed, they feel dirty, and they feel like you're going to freak out. Some of you have given them zero reason to fear that. I'm convinced that in a room with this many people, some of y'all have set a table that's open and safe and honest, but you can't make them believe that. But some of us haven't done that. Some of us, by the way that we respond to other people's sin and to our own kids when they fail in some area and we freak out or we overreact or we shame them, or we say, just go, I don't even want to see you right now. There are things that we do that discourage them from bringing the really difficult things to us. And we have to realize that that's not good enough anymore. So what do we do instead? Well, why don't we talk to them? There's a number of reasons why we don't do it. I mean, number one is we're just scared. Sometimes we're just scared to do it. We're scared because we might say something wrong. They might laugh at us. They may make fun of us with their friends. We're just afraid we're going to get tongue-tied. Some of us don't talk about it because we're at a loss. I mean, like, my kids know more about this than I do. How in the world do I talk to them about technology? I don't know how all this stuff works. They clearly know much more about this than I do, and I'm going to look like an idiot. And, you know, there are some parents who don't talk to their kids about sex because we're ashamed. Because it's not just their struggle, because it's our struggle too. I am going to take a risk and tell a story that involves Katie. She's here tonight. She and Jonathan drove up from Auburn. Katie's 21. When she was 8, I was neck deep in my own sex addiction, and nobody knew. Nobody knew. I was in full-time pastoral ministry. I was hiding it. I was terrified of exposure, but I was keeping a lid on it. And I came home from work one day, and I walked in the door next to where the computer was, and here is my little third grade, 8-year-old Katie on the computer, and the image I saw was of a woman performing oral sex on another woman. And I freaked out a little bit. I kind of dove over Katie, and I minimized the window, and I'm like, why are you looking at this? She said, it just popped up. It just popped up. And that was kind of true and kind of not true. She and one of her friends had been talking at school about, kind of laughing about, hey, do you think this is a website? Am I remembering that right? And I think one of the friends said, oh, you think bigbutts.com is a website? Ha, 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 you know. So she came home and she typed in bigbutts.com. If you've ever been to a website that's not an actual domain, but it's a parked website, it says like this domain is available, and then sometimes there'll be a bunch of links. And I think that was something like that. There were just a bunch of links. And 8-year-old Katie started clicking links and started seeing things that she'd never seen before. And when Stacy talked to her about it later, she said it made her sick to her stomach, made her feel horrible, and yet there was something that just draws you in, whether you want to or not. And I felt absolutely devastatingly ashamed. I somehow figured this is because of my stuff. Now we actually handled that, I think, fairly well. We didn't like totally freak out, but man, it scared me, and I wasn't ready to engage because I was neck deep in this myself. And moms and dads, if you have a struggle with compulsive sexual behavior, whether it's pornography, masturbation, if you have been stepping outside of your marriages and being sexual with other people, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for you to accept the grace of God to bring healing and freedom in your life. And don't you think for a second that God can't use the healing that he does in your life to help your kids. Ask Katie about that. She was 14 when everything hit the fan and I was exposed. God used that in her life. So if that's one of the reasons you don't talk, let's work on that. There is grace for you. So what are some of the things we say? What are some ways we can frame the questions? Now, there's going to be a bunch of them, and we're not going to take a lot of time because I want to wrap up soon and leave time for questions. But, some of the way that we ask questions, some of the ways that we frame them, our body language, our tone of voice, you might want to kind of practice before you have these conversations and ask questions like, well, how old were you the first time you saw pornography? Why ask it that way? Why not say, have you ever seen pornography? What happens when you ask a yes or no question? You're going to get a one-word answer, and it's probably going to be a lie. Okay? So, and I learned a lot of these techniques selling cars, by the way. You learn how to ask the right questions, okay? To draw questions that have to give them or make them respond in a way that's going to give you more information, okay? That's not manipulation. That's good active listening. So how old were you the first time you saw pornography? When you ask that question that way, it tells them, I assume you've already seen it. And look at this. This is not my freak out face. Okay? We're just going to talk about it. I know you've seen it. By the time I was your age, I had seen it. How old were you the first time? How did that make you feel? Where do you usually see it? Is it on your phone, your iPad, computer? And they're thinking, oh, they're going to take it away from me. And we don't ask them so that we can take it away from them. We ask them so that we can understand how we can maybe help them to learn how to use the technology more responsibly. Do your friends talk about or show you things that make you feel uncomfortable? How do you handle it when that happens? Do you say anything? See, these are some of the questions that are going to really help to open up a dialogue. And by the way, it may take a while, so keep trying. Don't try it once and say it didn't work. We've got to be able to talk to our kids about pornography. We've got to be able to talk to our kids about masturbation. Okay, there's some great resources to help us do that. There's one of the books in the back is called Father-Son Accountability, and I got a copy of that at the Set Free Summit by a father and a son who had written it together. It's a short little book. Dads, if some of you all want to really get real with your sons, take a picture of that book cover and order it and go through it together. Talk to your son about what it was like for you and how you see that masturbation, the way you did it, affected your sexual health and life. I can't talk to him about that. Why? Do you think your son thinks that you never masturbated? This is the kind of thing we need to be able to talk to them about. Talk to them about sex with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Okay, if they have a boyfriend or girlfriend, you cannot assume that it is not happening. You can't assume that it is, but this has got to be something we talk about. And again, you're not giving the green light. You're not saying it's okay. But a lot of times it's more effective if before we start saying, so this is what you've got to do and not do, ask more questions than you make statements. Asking questions really helps to engage them instead of shutting them down and saying, here's the decree. Okay? You'll get to that point. But I've always found that it's more effective, and I walk away with something more strongly when somebody helps lead me to recognize it myself than if they start at square one saying, this is how you need to think and feel and believe. Well, that's you trying to smack your thoughts and feelings and beliefs into me. Well, all I may be doing is just acting like you, putting a mask on. And you think, well, I've done my job. They're going to conform. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they're just thinking, I got to do a better job of hiding. So draw them into a lengthy conversation. As much as you want to freak out, if your daughter says, well, yeah, my boyfriend and I have had sex, as much as you want to go, oh my God, and start weeping, try to resist that urge and ask questions and stay in it. You'll get to the point of showing her that is not best. That's not God's design for you. He wants so much more. He wants so much more for you. You're worth more than that. You have a value that's not defined by having sex with somebody. Same-sex attraction, guys, we've got to be willing to discuss this. It is happening, and one of the reasons why it's happening so much more frequently is because our kids, when they're in older elementary, middle school, high school, are experiencing all kinds of weird sexual feelings, okay? And some of y'all remember what that was like. Feeling like if you're a guy, if you saw some guy that was like just cut and just really good looking and like feeling something, like, oh my gosh, am I gay? You've just got all kinds of things swirling around, okay? Your brain doesn't know how to process that yet. That doesn't mean you're gay. It means that you are maturing, and give it time, it's going to settle down. But what we have is we've got the world, whether it be political or social or entertainment or otherwise, celebrating 10-year-olds who've decided I'm gay. Because they're experiencing a normal sexual feeling that just has to be processed. And if mom and dad won't freak out and will just kind of walk them through it, more times than not, that's going to regulate itself, okay? So there's a number of reasons from external sources why our kids are experiencing a greater degree of same-sex attraction than they used to. We can't be afraid to talk about it, and we can't be afraid of what we might hear, and we can't freak out. We've got to talk to them about the spiritual implications, the relationship effects, the emotional effects, the physical risks of what they're doing. By the time we have asked the questions and really gotten them to open up, now we can say, I want to share some of what I learned. Stacy and I have been able to share with our kids, we didn't have sexual intercourse before we were married, but we did everything else. We were very sexual with each other. We were technical virgins, but we messed around, and it really messed us up. And we have experienced the negative effects of misusing our sexuality with each other, even into our marriage. Over months and months of go, 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 stop at a certain point, and go, 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 stop before you do that. A ceremony and then a honeymoon night, your brain is still saying stop, even though you're able to keep going. And so we can say, look, there are things that are going to happen. I just want to share with you some of my own experiences so that you'll know it's not just short term. There are things you don't realize are going to happen. We can earn the right to be heard. You might say, well, I don't have to earn the right. I'm their parent. Yeah, but from their perception, you've got to earn the right for them to listen to you. They can sit there quietly while you talk, but do you want them to sit there quietly while you talk, or do you want them to listen? And one of the ways that they listen is with empathy and understanding, asking questions, not freaking out. So again, this doesn't work if you bury your head in the sand and ignore it. It doesn't work if you freak out. We want to be non-freakers outers. You want this, a lot of times when you start, it's going to look more like this, right? How many of you have had a conversation like that? And they're sitting there rolling their eyes. Oh my gosh, when will you stop talking? That's our son Matthew. I can't guarantee you, but I feel very strongly that many of those eye rollers and huffers and sighers and arm crossers will come back to you later and say, I'm so thankful that you cared enough about me to drive me crazy talking about this stuff. Because they will come to a day when they'll know that you weren't doing it just to get on their nerves, but you were doing it because you love them. So these are some of the things that we want to say. These are some of the messages. And again, I'm going to go through them quickly. Porn is not who you are, okay? Porn will never meet your needs. It won't bring you joy or happiness. It's going to hurt all of your future relationships. I know because I had the same struggle as you. Maybe I have the same struggle as you, depending on what's going on. I believe in you. Is that something that we would normally say when we're in that kind of a conversation? You know what? I believe, son, I believe, sweetheart, that you've got what it takes to live a life that's honoring to God, because I see him in you, and I see a desire in you to serve him in so many ways, and I believe this can be one of them. You were made for more than this. You have so much to offer in relationships that has nothing to do with sex. I want others to benefit from really knowing you. I want you to learn how to pursue intimacy, healthy, non-sexual intimacy in your relationships, because people need to know you. People will be better because they have a relationship with you. Joy and happiness come from living according to who God says you are. Okay? Joy and happiness don't come from trying hard enough to live up to God's standard. As a Christ follower, that's not where they come from. They come from living out of a belief that you are who God says you already are. The work has been done. The finished work has been done by Jesus on the cross. Let me give you an example. Let's take shoplifting for an example. I use this example at senior high camp. You're in a store, you see a pair of jeans you want, you steal them. Uh-oh, here come the police. You got caught. The store clerk saw you do it. There were witnesses. You get the handcuffs put on. You go to jail. You have your court date. You go before the judge. You know that you are dead to rights, guilty. But then that judge comes in. He hears all the evidence. He pounds his gavel, and he says, not guilty. And you're like, huh? Of course I'm guilty. I did it. Why would he say you're not guilty? Well, in the case of our spirituality, it's because someone already paid for what you did. Someone has already paid. Think about telling this to your son or daughter. Someone has already paid for all the mistakes that you've made. Someone has already loved you enough, even knowing that you were going to do X, Y, Z. And he did it anyway because he loved you. One of the things that we do in our weekly recovery meetings, the Awaken groups that meet here at Brook Hills, is we don't only read about recovery principles and techniques and tactics and processes, but we read a lot of theology, because we need to understand behavior is what we see, and we don't like it, and we want to stop. So we focus on stop the behavior, stop the behavior, stop the behavior, stop the behavior. But what we fail to realize a lot of the time is that there is belief that is driving that behavior. We don't believe that we're really who God says we are. We believe that we're shameful, that we're broken worse than other people, that God is angry with us, that if you knew what I'd done, you'd have nothing to do with me, and that drives us to isolation, which feeds the beast. One of the things that we do every week is we read excerpts from the Heidelberg Catechism. And question and answer 60 I want to put up on the screen, because this, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, this is who God says you are and what he says is true about you. How are you righteous before God? Only by true faith in Jesus Christ. Even though my conscience accuses me of having grievously sinned against all God's commandments, of never having kept any of them, and even though I am still inclined toward all evil, nevertheless, without deserving it at all, out of sheer grace, God grants and credits to me the perfect satisfaction, righteousness, and holiness of Christ, as if I had never sinned nor been a sinner. As if I had been as perfectly obedient as Christ was obedient for me. All I need to do is accept this gift of God with a believing heart. That's a lot. But what that distills down to, and you can say this to your son or daughter, when I walked into your room and I caught you looking at porn and masturbating, in that moment, God looked at you and he saw Jesus. And they're going to be like, what? No, he didn't. Yes, he did, because he chooses to. Because if you're in Christ, what you do is not who you are. And why the things that you do make you miserable is because that's not who you are. You're not acting out of your true identity. You're acting out of your old identity, and that doesn't satisfy. There's no joy there. There's no peace there. There's misery. Why? Because when you're acting out in that way, you're being a hypocrite. You are a beloved son or daughter of the King. He sees Christ's satisfaction, righteousness, and holiness in you, and you're not experiencing that. I want better for you. Let me help you to find that. This is the grace that we want. So, wrapping it up, we want to have this kind of a message that's in our conversation. We don't want to have the talk. We want to have an ongoing conversation with our sons and daughters.